Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Zateo Town Hall. Appreciate you all coming to join us as we talk to Green Party leader Zack Polanski, who's joining me now from the UK. The Green Party, for those of you who aren't paying attention, is having a bit of a moment right now in the UK. Real surge, real momentum, tied with Labour in the polls. Labour being the party of government, tied in multiple polls with the Labour Party and on the up and up. So much to discuss with Zack Polanski. Is it because Labour's doing badly, or is it because the Greens are doing well? Many questions to ask. I'm sure you will have questions to ask. So please do stick your questions in the Q&A. I've got the Q&A open in front of me. So please do stick your written questions and we will get to them. But Zack, thank you so much for joining us here at Zateo.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really pumped to be doing it.
So the Times has a headline this week. Starmer warned of Green Party exodus over reform obsession. Labour may soon be hemorrhaging left-wing voters to Zack Polanski's party, which is surging in polls amid disillusionment with the Labour Party's shift to the right. Was that the plan, Zack, to come in, go left, occupy the space that Labour is vacating? Is that a deliberate strategy?
That's always been the plan. I've said success looks like when the Labour government are more worried about losing votes and seats to the Green Party than to reform. Obviously, I want to win more elections at the local elections next year and the general election, whenever that might be. But we don't even have to wait for elections. What I'm hoping we're going to start seeing is Keir Starmer and the Labour government start to take positions that are better for the people of this country, that are better for the 99% rather than the 1%. And that's already starting to happen a little bit, even in terms of the budget they're talking about next month. They're already talking about wealth taxes. They won't be going far enough. I'm sure they won't be doing what they need to do, but just the fact the conversation is changing, showing the strategy is working.
Zack, what would you say to critics who say you just got elected leader, you're having a honeymoon, you're having a surge, this is temporary, this is a protest vote against Labour? The fact that you're tying with Labour, don't start dreaming. Once the elections get near, you will fall back, they will go ahead. What do you say to people who say that?
Let's say if people want to underestimate the Green Party, go ahead. But actually what we're seeing is more and more members joining every single day. In fact, we just overtook the Conservatives who were in government last year. That's 130,000 members now. Just to be clear about why that is staggering, that's an 85% increase since I became leader of the party, and that's just in 1 month. So we're on track to double our membership, probably this month if people keep joining at the rate that they are. There's been days where we've had 6,000 people join in one single day, and these always coincide with when I've just come off the TV. And the reason why this matters is because for a long time, the Green Party just weren't given coverage in the UK.
Yes.
And Reform and Nigel Farage have constantly had coverage. So it's not a surprise when journalists say to me, oh, but the whole country cares about immigration. And I'm like, that's because you're constantly being pounded by Farage and the right that immigration is the #1 thing you should care about. So what I want to make sure is that I'm all over the media telling people that if you're worried about immigration, if you're worried about the fact you can't get a hospital appointment or a council home, or you're worried about the cost of living, you're right to be worried about all of those things. But those aren't the problems of migrants. Those aren't the problems of people who are fleeing for their lives from violence or persecution. Those are the problems of multimillionaires and billionaires, and even more, government politicians who for decades have committed austerity, underinvestment, and refused to redistribute wealth around our country.
The media plays a big role in Britain's rightward trend, as you mentioned. Nigel Farage would not be the person he was today if he hadn't had a near record number of appearances on Question Time. He has, what, 5 or 6 MPs? I can't keep track because people keep getting suspended and defecting. You have 4 MPs. How do you explain a quote-unquote liberal media and neutral BBC giving so much coverage to reform and not to the Greens? In fact, you had members of Parliament before they did.
It's absolutely outrageous, and there's no other word for it. I was on Question Time last week with a guy called Zia Youssef, who was the chair of Reform. He resigned, and then a day later, he was back with Reform. They're always quite messy in how they do things. And I think that was his 5th appearance this year on Question Time, whereas it was my first ever appearance on Question Time, despite having been deputy leader for the last 3 years. Now, on the left, though, I always say we can complain about those things, and it's perfectly legitimate to complain about them. But actually, the real question I'm interested in is what are you going to do about it? And I think there are lots of different ways now to bypass mainstream media, supporting independent media, shout out to Zateo, many of the other organizations we've got in the UK and around the world. But also I think social media is becoming increasingly important. Now we know that's problematic in itself because of the algorithms, because of Elon Musk and the various awful people who control those algorithms. But I also think there is something more insurgent there around people power. And actually, if you can create the content, if you can amplify narratives, particularly of marginalized people or stories that aren't often told, that becomes really interesting to people. And I think that becomes unstoppable. And I really credit social media to why the Green Party are partly having this moment right now, because we're reaching people in ways they've never been reached before.
You're clearly attracting attention. Some of it is negative, as you can imagine. People fear left-wing populist challenges. We're seeing that with Zoran Mamdani in New York City. In fact, 2 days ago, Bloomberg.com ran an op-ed saying the British Zoran Mamdani is a distraction we can't afford, referring to you. What's your reaction to that headline? Liking this video? Then don't just watch. Hit like, share, and subscribe. And tap the bell so you never miss a video or live show. But if you want early access to exclusive content, then you have to head to Zeteo.com and subscribe now. You'll be supporting fearless, independent journalism.
I mean, it's bloody phenomenal. I absolutely love Zoran, so I think that's a huge compliment.
What was meant to be an insult is taken as a compliment by you.
It's quite wild, I have to say. So I work at City Hall, and I saw Sadiq Khan the other day, and he was very excited for me that I was being compared to Zoran, which is not the reaction I was expecting from him. I think actually, though, what it speaks to is what Zoran's been doing and what I'm also doing in the UK. And we're seeing this across the world, actually, which I think is this kind of resurgence of the left, of saying actually populism is not something that the right should be able to own. Nigel Farage or Donald Trump is not a populist. They're people who claim to be men of the people, but they're men of the wealthy people. They're literally the 1%. Yeah. And so populism is the 99% versus the 1%. It's recognizing that whether it's working class communities, people running small businesses, hairdressers, plumbers, people who are out of work, all of us have so much more in common than the super elites. And a tiny group of people are running the UK. They hold our power, our wealth, and our assets. And ultimately, it's time to take them back.
So I want to talk about Gaza, which some people are already raising in the chat, and it's made you stand out in the way that Mamdani has stood out. But before I get to Gaza, you mentioned the 1%. Tell us more about the Green Party's proposal to introduce a 1% annual tax on assets over £10 million. How would that work?
Well, it's exactly that. So it's a tax on assets. And then immediately people say, but won't the wealthy just leave? Well, first of all, I think capital flight is really overstated. And in fact, I was interested to hear Zoran say to you in an interview that in America, people are moving to other states that have even higher tax thresholds. So the idea of capital flight, I think, whether it's in the States or whether, around the world, has largely been debunked. And when you look at the people who are propelling or propagating these myths, they are often the very wealthy people who control the media. And again, it becomes a media story. I think more widely than that, though, it's also important that we have a conversation about the fact a national economy is nothing like a household budget.
Yes.
And so when people talk about balancing the books or even taxing people to create public investment, that's actually the wrong way of looking at it. Of course, we need to create public investment, but actually what we need to do more than anything is reduce inequality. And the fact that a tiny few people can control our assets and that our public services can be sold off to private equity, both here in the UK and around the world, is deeply problematic in creating a bigger and bigger gap. In the UK, just like the US, since the pandemic began, billionaire wealth has doubled. Meanwhile, people are struggling. They're struggling to put food on the table, to put heat in their homes. All of that is the result of political choices, and we can make and should make different political choices.
Yeah, comparing the economy to a household budget gives me an ulcer. And to hear Labour politicians do it after spending years in opposition decrying Tories doing that is deeply unsettling. On the wealth tax issue, obviously one practical objection is they'll just leave. And as you say, that is overstated. The whole point of wealth taxes is on things like properties, which are hard to just up and move. But what about the other logistical complaint, which says, well, how do you value 10 million? Is there going to be a new government agency? Who's going to say you're worth 10 million?
Well, this is where the second part of challenging the household deficit myth comes in, which is ultimately talking about spending multipliers. Every pound or dollar that you're spending, if you spend that wisely on public services, then you're getting that money back into your economy. And I think one of the best examples is HMRC, which for international viewers is essentially our tax services. And if you're investing in that, so the super rich can't just avoid paying the tax, then that makes a lot of sense because you have both a fairer taxation system and you're getting that money back. This is where the climate crisis comes in too. There's lots of research that shows every pound that is spent on green infrastructure, you're getting £1.88 back. So that's about investing in renewable energy, in the green transition. Make sure that you've got jobs that are in the public sector. They're being paid properly. They can be in trade unions where people are being treated with dignity and care at work. very often the climate crisis gets pitted against the cost of living crisis, but actually it's the opposite. To challenge our cost of living crisis, we can also use this moment where we need to transform our societies to create greener jobs, to make sure we have more cohesive communities and actually have a sense of bringing people together rather than allowing the super elites again to pollute our planet, our environment, our democracy and our communities.
What would you say to people, even in your own party, who maybe didn't vote for you in the leadership election and say, we want the Green Party to focus on green issues. We were known as the climate change party. We don't want to be known as, the Jeremy Corbyn party or the Left Party or the Socialist Party. We want to be known as the Green Party. What would you say to them?
Well, first of all, it's always where I'm delighted to say I won on 85% on the vote. So gladly, this hasn't been a huge issue. But I think the wider point is you can't be an environmentalist without caring about inequality, because it is the corporations and the polluters who are destroying our planet and destroying our communities. I think more widely than that, there's a strategic thing here. In the UK, when you poll people, including from other parties, do you trust the Green Party on the environment? We come out with a huge majority and no one else comes anywhere closer. Where we have struggled in the past is to deal with the economy and to deal with defense. And actually, I think we have a strong story to tell on defense. I think we have a strong story to tell on the economy. So actually, I prefer to center those issues because those are the issues that we know have greater salience. People really care about them. And they're also a story that far too often we've ceded to the right, particularly on defense around NATO, the idea that we can trust the special relationship with Donald Trump. I don't need to tell you that this man is a misogynist, a racist, and someone who's threatened to annex Greenland and Canada.
And
So
the
the idea
climate
that we
denier.
want to outsource our security to this wild man in the White House seems deeply problematic to me. At the same time, where we had Brexit, one of the most catastrophic decisions this country has ever made, both in terms of our culture, our economy, but indeed our security too. And so I think building closer relationships with our European neighbours, of course, we need a relationship with the US, but it doesn't definitely not need to be a relationship where we roll out the red carpet for a horrendous president.
Here in the US, as you know, one of the big issues is immigration. Donald Trump has ICE rounding up people, including US citizens, in his attempt to try and kind of reduce the population, basically, population size. In the UK, they say the US sneezes, the UK catches a cold. UK is catching up with everything the US does. The UK right now is talking a lot about deportations. You were on the Peston show on ITV, I saw the other night, with a Conservative MP who's been calling for legal immigrants to be deported, not just quote unquote illegal immigrants. So the Conservative Party, the Reform Party are really kind of borrowing some of the MAGA rhetoric. What do you say to people who say, whether you like it or not, that's where the British public is? The British public are bothered by immigration, whatever the reasons, maybe because of BBC bias, maybe because of Nigel Farage getting a bigger platform. But how does the Green Party, how do you turn that super tanker around? This years and years of anti-immigrant rhetoric has, whether we like it or not, turned the British public against this.
I think that's where we've all got to get better at storytelling. So for a long time, I think on the left and in progressive spaces, we've talked about data and statistics, which are really important. Things like if you use the National Health Service, the person who treats or cares for you is so much more likely to be a migrant than anyone in front of you in the queue. The fact that migrants are more likely to put money into our tax system than they are to take out. And I always say that economic issues aside, people shouldn't feel like they need to do some trick to be welcome in our country. I think just common decency and humanity, and to recognize that the UK is largely built on migration and actually diversity is one of our greatest strengths. I can say all of these as much as I want. I also recognize that someone who's thinking about voting for reform isn't hearing this. They just don't agree. And so they're always expecting politicians to lie. So that's why we've got to get much better at storytelling and recognize people do really have genuine fears. Now, this is different to the legitimate concern rhetoric that we often hear about appeasing the right or appeasing to racist or fascist rhetoric. But I also think it is important not to lecture people or just tell them they're wrong. I think it's important to meet them where they're at in terms of their fears, and then make sure you're creating a compelling story about what the real threat is. And the biggest point, that whether you're in the US or the UK, we are constantly being distracted. The culture war bullshit that is like coming out every single day that is being propagated by Trump, but also Reform, the Conservative government, and frankly, Keir Starmer too. This is a prime minister who stood on the stage and pretty much echoed Enoch Powell with his Island of Strangers speech. He said that he didn't realize this is what he was doing, which either makes him incredibly ignorant, which is pretty dangerous, or, willing to flirt with racism. And I'm not sure which is worse.
You say flirt with racism. Let me just ask you bluntly, how racist is the British political class right now?
I think it's intensely racist. I think what's almost worse about it is how insidious it is, that it kind of has been bubbling down for a long time. It reminds me of last year, after we had the racist riots in our streets, there were lots of places like Walthamstow and Birmingham where I was proud to be there, where lots of people gathered in the street and said, we are an anti-racist collective. But racism didn't go away. There are still people outside asylum hotels threatening to incite violence to the people inside. And asylum seekers aside, just people of color who were born here or have made their home here are facing increased racism as well. And so I worry that this kind of liberalism of kind of, if we just kind of all gather together and get on and just allow people to make money, everything's going to be okay, has been totally shattered. And actually, I think the racism that's existed in society for a long time, the mask is off. And I think it's about how do we deal with that right now and make sure we're harnessing that anger to actually face it to the 1%. And again, turn it into hopeful solutions rather than just dealing with anger, because that's what the right do. But if we don't connect with people's anger, then I think it does seem pretty out of touch and can often feel just a little middle class and not really connected with where our communities are.
When you have conservatives, and just in the last 48 hours, I think you've got former Conservative MP Paul Goodman writing in the Telegraph saying Islam has been a problem in Britain for a long time. You have Robert Jenrick, Britain should ban the burqa. You have Claire Coutinho, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name wrong, Shadow Education Secretary, I believe she's saying political Islam is a growing problem in this country. Nick Timothy, Conservative Assistant Whip, saying Islamism is now a big force in our society. We need to do something about it. How dangerous is that rhetoric towards Muslims in the UK?
It's phenomenally dangerous, and Islamophobia is rife in our society. And I say this as a Jewish man. There's only been 5 Jewish leaders of a British political party in the last 100 years. So I obviously take anti-Semitism really seriously, but I think it can strike anyone who's paying attention for more than 30 seconds, the amount that we talk about anti-Semitism compared to the amount we talk about Islamophobia. Now, we shouldn't pit these two things against each other. They're two sides of the same coin. And when people hate one minority community, they often hate all minority communities. And I think the best work is when people stick together. But it's really clear to me that when I think, particularly online, of the people with Israeli flags in their profile or pro-Zionist kind of groups, they hate me more than they hate anyone, and that's because they are deeply anti-Semitic. And so when you have people in the center flirting with the Zionists in a way that kind of they're trying to find these unlikely alliances, particularly when they're uniting because the thing they share in common is hating Muslims, I also think they're incredibly playing with fire. And so I think the only thing you can do is take a step back and go, how can we make sure that our communities are more cohesive? And I think a huge part of it, integration is the thing that the right keep talking about at the moment. And I think my initial instinct was to not get into that conversation because it's often been code word for just blatant racism. But I do think there is a helpful conversation to have about integration, that if you commit austerity and you shut down the libraries, the community centres, you don't allow physical spaces for people to gather, break bread together, pray together, or just have a conversation together, then it shouldn't be surprised when you then get divided communities that feel like they don't integrate. And so I think a lot of this does come down to underinvestment and to deliberate underinvestment. Thatcher said there's no such thing as society. The Tories then started to destroy our communities, and Labour under Keir Starmer have just been happy to carry on with that same rhetoric.
It's a great point. My friend Nesreen Malik made that point in The Guardian this week, the idea that you have nowhere to go and meet with other people, and then we're told you don't integrate. On the specific issue of racism, Islamophobia, the right, what do you think Labour should be doing? Because there's talk now of them having shelved their definition of Islamophobia. There was going to be an Islamophobia definition. You also, by the way, you touched on something very interesting just now about, you know, the two sides of the same coin, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. One thing that's been deeply depressing over this recent row over the Israeli football team, Maccabi Tel Aviv coming to play at Aston Villa with their fans, the police saying don't bring your fans. Now they've said they're not bringing their fans. It's become the biggest story in the UK for those of you watching outside of the UK, bizarrely. One of the most depressing parts of that is the people trying to defend the Israeli football fans and saying they should be allowed to come can't do it without being Islamophobic. Right? It's weird. I was like, let's have a challenge. Can anyone make a good faith argument without saying it's because Muslims in Birmingham have taken over the country and it is an Islamist plot? Not that police officers looked at intelligence and said it won't be safe, or not that the Maccabi Tel Aviv people have a history of violence and racism, including in Amsterdam. You said you're a Jewish party leader. What do you make of that whole row and the claims of anti-Semitism there?
I mean, it's been absolutely outrageous. And I suppose the first thing I'd start with is one of my deputy leaders, Mamdani, is a Muslim man. And I think that's an exciting moment in British politics. where you have a Jewish leader and a Muslim deputy leader working side by side. And so he put out a brilliant comment, essentially about the football team, saying, even stepping aside, why isn't the Israeli football team being allowed to play at all when you should be in boycott, divestment, sanctions, and ultimately with Russia or a Russian city, we wouldn't let them play. Israel is currently perpetrating a genocide. Let's have a conversation about that. And actually, I didn't comment other than amplifying what he said because he'd said it all. And I thought sometimes you don't need to wade into a culture war. My deputy leader said it, I'm going to amplify it. And then the Guardian Sports page wrote a whole kind of article about this, which spent the most of the article attacking me for having been the only leader that hadn't spoken out against a police decision. And so it was strange that they were attacking me for something I hadn't said.
So to be clear, you supported the police decision?
No. Yes, I do support the police decision.
And you would also go further and say, actually, Israeli, forget the hooliganism angle. I mean, some people seem to be struggling, to chew gum and walk at the same time. I've got Dan Hodges, the Mail journalist, been berating me all week, trying to get to do a gotcha on me. And I'm very open. My position is, in this specific case, clearly the police had a valid reason to say these hooligans shouldn't come here. It's not a big deal. Away fans are banned all the time, including English football fans. Why is this being blown into the biggest story in British history? Separate to that, even if there were no football hooligans, we should be having a conversation about banning Israel from international football. We banned Russia, which Dan Hodges supported. So I'm just checking, you do support banning this team or supporting the police decision, but you also are willing to talk about a wider debate about banning Israeli football because of genocide.
Undoubtedly all of that. And I would add the third thing too, to have a prime minister who's starving police of resources and then criticizing a police decision. At the same time, he's prescribing Palestine action, people holding cardboard signs saying...
Rounding them up, hundreds of them.
Totally. And so I think whatever layer you go to in this conversation, it was incredibly exposing of where our political class is in Britain and the outrageousness that was happening. The only reason why I mentioned that I hadn't commented on it wasn't because I was avoiding commenting. It's just if your deputy leader said something good as a Muslim man, I was like, I'm just going to amplify that. But then the Guardian still decided to go after the Jewish leader to call him anti-Semitic. I mean, it was just on whatever level you look at this story, it was not people's finest hour.
You mentioned you're a Jewish leader. You also mentioned a moment ago pro-Zionist people. Can I ask, do you consider yourself to be a Zionist?
No, not at all. So I grew up in a Zionist household and I went to a Jewish school. I think this has been a very common experience of lots of Jewish people. And I think our voices often aren't heard in the media because very specific types of Jewish voices are allowed to be heard. And they're the voices that are allowed to so-called represent the quote unquote mainstream organizations. And it's only in the last few years, really, as I've met lots more Jewish socialists, a group called Namod, who I believe are also in America, a group of Jews speaking out against the occupation, and also on the Palestine marches themselves, the huge Jewish blocks of people saying, this is not in our name. And again, I think it's the way that some voices are allowed to be platformed and other voices aren't allowed to be platformed it's very transparent.
I'm enjoying this conversation so much. I still haven't gone to our audience who've put a bunch of questions in the chat. I will come to the audience. Let me just ask one question from me. I feel like I'm losing my mind a bit watching the British debate over there. I have spent my entire career and life explaining to people on the left, in Muslim communities, in pro-Palestine circles, the importance of distinguish between Jews and Zionists, between Israel and the British or American Jewish communities. Over the last week in the UK, I've watched every top politician and top journalist do the exact opposite. Go out of their way to say this is about Jews, not Israelis. In fact, I saw the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, do an entire statement on Sky where she said Jews, 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 Jews. Didn't say the word Israeli once. If you were watching, you would think Birmingham's Jews can no longer go watch an Aston Villa game. This is deeply dangerous, is it not? I feel like I'm losing my mind. I feel like telling my Jewish friends and cousins and community members, like, this is bad for you because this is doing the anti-Semites work for them. This is saying, actually, all British Jews are easily swappable with Israeli football hooligans.
Yeah, I think I've got two answers there. One is political and one is personal. The political, yes, I think it's incoherent and ultimately does contradict everything that has been talked about for decades. But personally, yeah, you put your finger on it. It makes me feel less safe. Now, that's not to justify any anti-Semitism towards someone, whether they support the Israeli government or not. Those are two separate things. But without a doubt, this conflation, constant conflation, does make me feel less safe as a Jewish person because I look at what Netanyahu and Gallant do, and indeed when we invited the president over to the UK, and the idea that a Jewish person, by default of being Jewish, should in any way have anything to do with what's going on in Israel or feel any connection towards that government, I think is deeply, deeply problematic. And I think it's also pushed it to an awful place where I feel like I need to say that as a Jewish person because this conflation has got so bad. So it's deeply cynical. It's been done with a very, very strong political purpose.
Yeah.
And I suppose the most hopeful thing at the end of this initial conversation is I don't think it's working. When you look at polling, I can speak for the UK, people are massively opposed against this genocide and the selling of arms and the F-35
and opposed to the Tel Aviv team coming, by the way.
Right, exactly that. And so it really exposes the gap between where the public are and where the Westminster kind of old parties are. And I think that's exactly why we're seeing them crumble. And you're seeing this kind of really wanting to feel hope and feel hope is normal again, that actually people can speak with authenticity and just talk plainly about what is clearly the truth.
Are you a football fan yourself, Zack?
Yes, Forest Green Rovers, the vegan team.
Okay. I was going to ask, I said, can you safely go to a game? Because if the Martian landed right now and looked at British media coverage, it would be almost as if British Jews can no longer attend football games in the United Kingdom. That's the kind of insane rhetoric we're seeing. Let me go to our audience who've been waiting patiently in the chat. If you've got questions, stick them in the Q&A. We'll try and get through as many as we can. Mohammed Al-Abdali says, will you work to get your party, this is the Zara Sultan and Jeremy Corbyn party, to join the Green Party?
So look, I really like Zara and Jeremy both on a personal level and a political level. In fact, I've done so many panels with Zara recently. I've seen her more than I've seen my own boyfriend. We're just constantly in organizing circles together. And I've been really clear, both privately and publicly, that they would be both really welcome in the Green Party. Now, I need to put a small caveat there. They were an intensely democratic party, so it wouldn't just be my decision, be the decision of an elected body. But in terms of, what I can communicate, in terms of
do you
being
mean them joining as individuals or the parties merging?
I don't think there'll be a need for the party to merge, just in terms of the Green Party now have 130,000 members. We've existed for a long time and we're clearly on the up. Whereas, without being unkind to your party, I mean, that's not the name of the party. We don't even know what the name of the party is.
Fair.
I think they're quite a way away from existing. And I don't mean that as kind of, I'm not having a dig. People expect me not to want them to set up. But actually, I can be much more transparent than that. You'll know this, Mehdi, when you're on a TV panel, you're often the voice of the left, and then you're up against 3 or 4 people, and supposedly it's a spectrum of views, but actually they're in the exact same place. So if there are more people in the political kind of space who are saying similar things to what I am and campaigning on the same issues, then I welcome that, whether it's from the Green Party or not.
Perfect segue into my next question. Roshan Pedder asks, will Greens make the same mistake they made in the last election, i.e. not standing down where they had no chance of winning? Think Liane Mohammed and Wes Streeting. This was the pro-Palestine campaigner challenging the, at the time, Shadow Health Secretary. Almost beaten.
Yes. Well, there's a few things there. First of all, electoral kind of behavior doesn't always work in the way that we want it to work. So if a party steps down, that could have easily just as helped Labour. So I always have to challenge the premise that is causing vote splitting. Second, Wes Streeting, I should have started with this, is horrendous. He's always been pretty bad, but I think since he's been health secretary, he really has been one of the worst in that cabinet, both on Gaza, but also his total lack of solidarity with the LGBT community, particularly trans people, and various other positions he's taken. So I absolutely want to see Wes Streeting out. At the same time, the Green Party took a collective democratic decision. We are one member, one vote, that we were going to stand in every single seat. So that was a grassroots decision. I think as a party, you're entitled to do that. And again, I would say to people who are running as independents, join the Green Party. If there is a policy you don't like, we have a democratic mechanism to be able to change that policy. And so again, I'm really looking to build the Green Party at this point and go, what does it look like when we're really challenging this Labour government and taking the fight to reform? And I think this was arguable a few months ago, but now it's irrefutable that the Green Party is the space. It's the party of the left right now that is building and growing every single day.
Marvin says, what type of any conversations have you had with Green parties beyond the UK, especially in Europe? He also has an extra question from his friend Ben. I don't know why Ben's not in the chat, asking himself, what's the Green Party's stance on nuclear power? They've been against it in the past. Are you looking into this again?
Great. I'll start with the negative and move to the positive. So I've had some really difficult conversations with Green parties around Europe, particularly the German Greens. So I went to a European Congress. We have no official affiliation with them. It's a very informal relationship. but we had conversations about where parties need to be going in the future. Now, I think it is important to say in Germany that people often pit the Green Party against the Linke, who are a left-wing party in Germany. Neither party at the time of the last German election would call what was happening in Gaza a genocide. I don't think that's acceptable from either party, but I do think it's something that's quite characteristic of German politics because of their history with the Holocaust and the squeamishness. Now, what I'm saying, I can hear the incoherency as a British person. Because the Holocaust happened in your country, I would imagine is another reason why you would call what's happening in Gaza a genocide. Because when we say never again, that should not be never again for one person or one group of people. That should be never again for anyone. Having said that, that is where German politics is at. So I've seen it as partly my role with European Green parties who are not in the places that I think they should be, to not to backseat drive, that's not my job, but also to be honest and to be a critical friend, and I've done that both publicly and privately. On the flip side of that, you've got a group like the New Zealand Greens. The co-leader there, Chloe Swarbrick, has been an incredibly fierce voice for speaking out for the Palestinians on drug reform, on wealth tax. And in fact, I have my own podcast, sorry, this is a cheap plug here, called Bold Politics. Went to #3 in the country the day I launched it, and I just released an interview last week with Chloe Swarbrick, where we talk a lot about Palestine and the work she's been doing to look to divest and also stop the selling of weapons.
We're happy to do plugs, Zach. You're a politician. You
Sorry,
mentioned
I
drugs.
didn't do nuclear power.
Before you didn't do nuclear power. Do nuclear power, then I've got a quick follow-up.
So I don't have a huge ideological issue with nuclear power. My issue with nuclear power is that it's slow and expensive, and we have alternatives. We have renewable energy, and actually I think that's where we should be investing our money. I think putting money into nuclear power right now is finding the fax machine and going, I think this is a really big new thing. I think the second thing is around security, these kind of big infrastructure projects that Boris Johnson and the Tories loved. I don't think of the way forward. And actually, I think the way forward, even in challenging fascism, is community power and community energy. Because actually, when you have projects where people don't feel like politics is being done to them, but they're actually involved in the process, they're getting the money into their community, they're choosing what happens with the money in the community. I don't mean it in a motherhood and apple pie way, but I think that's one of the ways you rebuild community cohesion and bring people together. So much more about community energy and renewables.
You mentioned the drugs just a moment ago. You have a quite radical proposal to legalize all drugs, not just marijuana, but cocaine, heroin, everything. What do you say to people who say it sounds great in theory, but for the communities who suffer from the fallout from this stuff? What do you say to vulnerable communities? Often some of the poorest communities in the country.
Well, actually, I think the radical approach is to assume that the war on drugs is working and that what we're doing right now is in any way tenable. I meet with an organization called Anyone's Child, who work with people who have lost their children, grandchildren, siblings to the war on drugs, who are saying it's not about just legalizing, it's about regulating. So actually, I come at it from a safety point of view. If people are going to be taking drugs, do we want them buying them in alleyways or through gangs where they don't know what they're taking and they're not able to receive support? Or do we want to take a public health approach where medical health professionals are creating spaces where if people have problematic relationships with drugs, then they can receive the support that they need with that?
So you're not saying anyone can just walk into their high street boots and get some coke?
No, absolutely not. In fact, the police commissioner in London asked my colleague that recently, which shows the level of seriousness that the police are treating this with. There's also a huge racial injustice angle here, where young black men in London are stopped and searched 8 times more than their white counterparts, despite the fact the evidence shows that no peer group is more likely to take drugs. You also talk about working class communities and people in poverty who are taking drugs. There is lots of very wealthy drug taking. It's just less likely to be criminalized. So I think there's huge injustices throughout the whole drug market. And ultimately, this is about saying, let's regulate it. And also, this is money that can be going into the treasury as well. And that money can be used to be supporting people through healthcare interventions to get people off drugs and alcohol.
Aisha Begum says, not a question, but she says, first time I've ever become a paid political member, I assume of your party. She says, I always voted Labour, no more. I'm so excited to actively push the Greens in my community, which is an Asian/Labour stronghold. So that's someone you've got there. Negat Khan says, what are your plans to woo reform voters who seem to be your biggest opponents right now?
Yeah, this is a really interesting conundrum. Now, if I'm really honest, I think there's a whole spectrum of reform voters or people who are thinking about voting reform. I think there's a small block who are explicitly racist. They hate immigrants. They're socially conservative. And actually, there's almost nothing I can do right now to win them over. And so I think we've just got to beat them. I think there's a much bigger block, though, who are sick of the old two-party system, who looked at the Conservatives, hated austerity, might have voted Labour because they thought that Keir Starmer was going to bring about change. This is a man who, if you're in an international audience, might not know, has cut benefits for disabled people, has got a cap on two children, which is one of the biggest drivers of child poverty, who, again, we've talked about it several times here, who is arming a genocide in Israel and said Israel had a right to cut off water and electricity from the Palestinians. He said that's not what he said. But just a few hours later, Emily Thornberry, one of the shadow ministers at the time, went out and doubled down on that. So I can understand why people want to reject that old party politics. And I meet these people all the time. And actually, they've just not seen enough from the Green Party. They don't know that there's an alternative. I think the second thing when it comes to powerful storytelling is I did a video recently that went around on social media. I think it got seen 14 million times, which was me stood on a beach talking about the fact is actually the problem is the private jets and the private yachts and not the multimillionaires and billionaires. And from conversations I've had with many, many people who had previously voted reform, who were thinking about voting reform, that did shift the dial for them. For lots of people, they were still worried about immigration, but they said, you know what, I absolutely agree about the fair taxation system and the elites who are screwing us over. And I think it's connecting on the things you agree with and then slowly winning the argument on immigration.
I think we're seeing that with MAGA voters in the US as well, who do want higher taxes on the wealthy, who are anti-establishment, and then some of them are unfortunately.
Well, we saw
racist.
Bernie Sanders voters go to Donald Trump, right? And I think it's the exact thing. Yeah. I think it was
the anti-establishment commonality is there. Obviously, the racism part is problematic. Catherine Schubert says
I say no? I think it's even stronger than anti-establishment, though. I think what they're seeing in Bernie Sanders, and I realize that for some he's been problematic, but I would say he's generally a force for good. Is someone who speaks authentically, tells the truth even when it's unpopular. And then they were sick of a Democratic Party that felt like they weren't doing that. Now is Donald Trump doing those things? Of course he's not doing those things. He's not honest at all. But he gives the appearance of being honest, of the appearance of saying what he thinks.
Are you saying Sir Keir Starmer doesn't speak authentically? That would be an astonishing claim.
Not just saying that, I'm knowing
to make. Catherine Schubert says, the Green label is beginning to sound limiting. Have you thought of expanding the name? She suggests the Green Communist Party, which I'm guessing is not on your list of options. But the wider point is a good point, that if you're just seen as the Green Party, a lot of people just think of you as the people who just talk about renewable energy and protecting the environment. They don't know about your radical policies on taxation or foreign policy or drugs that you laid out today.
Well, I think that might have been a problem 2 months ago, but actually the question I get from the media constantly now is, do you not care about the environment anymore? So I actually think
I asked you the same question, so fair point.
Well, quite.
If the Green Party gets a shot at it, asks Aurelian Schaub. Oh, lost it. Hold on. If the Green Party gets a shot at it, will you get rid of the first past the post election system?
Can't get rid of it quick enough. And not just because actually it's really, really unfair on the kind of newer parties, but actually, more importantly, it's unfair for the country. The fact that how people vote is rarely represented in the final outcome. It's also really dangerous for fascism. We could get a Nigel Farage government on 27% of the vote, maybe even less, potentially with almost the majority of the power. Now, the fact that Keir Starmer does not support proportional representation right now shows the seriousness with which he's taking the reform threat, i.e. not as serious as he should be. And actually, the biggest thing Keir Starmer could be doing right now to stop a Nigel Farage government is working with the other parties and saying, let's make sure that we bring a fair voting system where everyone's vote counts. Without getting too policy wonky as well, there's some amazing stats around proportional representation that show on average around the world, it reduces your emissions by 18%. It reduces your chances of going to war. And that's not because proportional representation is good in and of itself. It's because it creates more consensual decision making, which results in better or more considered decisions.
Would you, you say consensual decision making, would you join a coalition with Labour at the next election if there's a hung parliament?
I think it's really hard to talk about the hypothetical, but if it was with Keir Starmer, I would find that incredibly difficult. I think.
But you're not anti-coalition politics, right? That's what PR produces.
Not at all. And in fact, I'm elected to the London Assembly, which is under proportional representation. So my daily political existence is working with people I vastly disagree with to try and find points of consensus. And actually, I see on a daily basis that it results in better politics.
By the way, Catherine Schubert wants to correct me. She did a typo. She was suggesting the Green Community Party, not the Green Communist Party, just to be clear. Yanina Captain says, what would you consider a realistic best case scenario in 2029 in the next general election or in the 2026 locals for the Greens?
Yeah, this is where I could get myself into trouble because I was talking about 30 Green MPs when I ran for leader between 30 and 40. That all being said, I didn't expect that our Green Party membership was going to nearly double in a month or two. And now membership numbers do not necessarily mean winning elections. And I need to be clear about that. We've got loads of work to do. It is a very good sign, though, and the amount of coverage we're getting and the amount of excitement there is on the streets about the Green Party right now does mean I think we should be scaling up our ambition. So that comes to the final point of your question. Next May, we have a huge set of elections in the UK around local elections, particularly in London and in Wales too, where we have the Senedd, and we're looking at Green representation for the first time there too. Now, the reason why all of this matters is because on the day that I won as Green Party leader, one of the things I said was I'm not here to be disappointed by Labour. I'm not here to be concerned by them. I'm here to replace them. And some journalists said, am I not speaking in hyperbole? But actually, this May, I get to demonstrate what I was talking about, because ultimately, replacing them at the ballot box in May will either get rid of Keir Starmer or it'll make him make a dramatic shift. And it also says to the future Prime Minister, you're not going to get away with this kind of, it's not even vapid centrism at this point, it's appeasement to the right. And actually, if you do that, people have an alternative place to go.
Yes.
So will it make my life harder if we have a prime minister who's more to the left or a more socialist prime minister? Absolutely, but I'll take that challenge any day because ultimately we'll have a better country, and that's the point of the whole exercise.
Well said. An anonymous attendee asked, you mentioned Brexit. Is rejoining the EU a Green Party aim?
Yes, it is. I think, so I'm not being disingenuous about it. It's not something I'm shouting about necessarily, because I think there is a point here that people made a decision. We had a referendum. Now, when you poll those people, people largely say it was a mistake and it was awful. So I think there's a really strong argument to have another referendum or another conversation about rejoining. But I also think there's a reckoning in the UK right now around inequality and cost of living, which is a more kind of immediate concerns that we need to be talking about. And I
But
think
you're not
Europe.
ruling out another referendum?
And no,
As
no,
a,
not at all. And I think I'm not ruling out necessarily rejoining Europe without a referendum. If a party like a Green Party were saying we would rejoin Europe and got a
so
huge mandate to do so, but all of these are quite hypothetical in the future scenarios.
we're almost out of time because squeezing a couple more questions. Amr Hamid says, what's your plan to improve the NHS if reducing managerial expansion and private companies is in your agenda?
Yeah, this is huge because Wes Streeting, earlier mentioned health secretary, has taken huge amounts of money from private healthcare donors. This is a Labour government that took £4.1 million during the election from Quadrature Capital. This is a hedge fund with assets in private healthcare, by the way, also oil and gas, gambling companies, and the arms trade. It's like all the bad gang together. So it shouldn't be a surprise that this Labour government are trying to do privatisation, sometimes through the back door, and other times I think it's more obvious. During the general election, by the way, I had a debate with Wes Streeting. I made this point. He lifted his hand towards my face and said, the left are bleating on again. I think it demonstrates that this was not bleating. It was a clear warning sign of what was to come. So in terms of the NHS, I think there's a few things. I think we need to be really clear about the importance of keeping it nationalized. You have this conversation constantly in America about Medicaid and private healthcare insurance. And I think it's clear, with no disrespect to the country you live in, Mehdi, what a shit show that is and how bad that
Yes, it
is. And
is.
actually, one of the things we should be proud of in our country is what the Attlee government did and set up healthcare for all. So the idea that it's going to be dismantled by a Labour government, even in bits, is pretty dire. So I think we need to win that argument by just being clear about our arguments. Second, we need to fund it properly. And third, I think it's about making sure that we're looking at preventative measures too, as well as adult social care. If you kind of cut corners in other places, then people end up in the healthcare system who never needed
Yes.
to be there in the first place.
Last question. Jane Crowther says, I've been watching this tribalist mentality for 6+ decades. It's everywhere all the time. Is there a real solution, or are we witnessing something in the human DNA that is impossible to overcome, which will ultimately make democracy short-lived? Zach, give us some hope before we wrap up.
I think there's loads of hope, and I think the hope is all the people who have joined the party and all the support I'm seeing both online and in the streets. And just to be clear, this isn't some kind of one-man band. I know that I'm the vehicle of a catalyst for this hope, but actually what people are seeing is hope in their own agency and hope in their own empowerment. The Green Party is not a top-down party. We're a community grassroots party. That can make it messy sometimes because democracy can be messy, but I take it that way any day because actually what it means is anyone who joined the party 10 years ago, a week ago, or at the end of this interview, there's another subtle plug there. Anyone who joins the party has equal agency and power in what the future of a party looks like. And I think that's hopeful for the Green Party, more importantly for the left, and more importantly than that, for the entire country.
Last question from me. If Zoran Mamdani wins in November, it's going to be an earthquake here in the US. I've argued publicly that it'll be a global earthquake. The parties around the world, leftist progressives around the world, will be inspired, learn lessons, be emboldened. What do you think the reaction will be in the UK if Mamdani wins the New York mayoral election?
I think it's happening already, to be honest. I think from him even winning the primary, I think demonstrated. I think this is the most important thing. I think we're in an interesting place in the discourse where there's this kind of backlash against so-called identity politics, and I get it. And we saw that with Kamala Harris. I also think, though, I was worried that it was veering in the wrong direction, which was saying we need to focus on economic populism and inequality. But what I wasn't hearing was solidarity with minority communities. I think what Zoran's been impeccable at, and should be the guiding light for all of us, is solidarity with minority communities is because inequality hits them hardest. So let's not get distracted talking about that solidarity. You demonstrate it quickly, you do it through your actions, and you get straight back onto cost of living, and you focus on that relentlessly, lowering people's bills, taxing billionaires, while still absolutely doing that in solidarity with all groups who are all suffering. This is the 99% versus the 1%. It's a hell of a fight, but it's a fight we're going to win.
We'll have to see. Hope to get you back just as we're going to get Mamdani back if he wins. Zack Polanski, thanks for taking time out of your busy media schedule. You seem to be all over our screens. I'm glad you're on a Zeteo screen now. I hear you're heading to my birthplace, Swindon, England, this week. Enjoy Swindon. I haven't been there for decades, and we hope to have you back very soon.
Thanks so much for having me. I've loved it.
Thanks everyone for watching in the chat. Please make sure all your friends and family are Zeteo subscribers. That's my plug for the day. Goodbye. Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to Zeteo.com. Your support matters.